When 8-year-old Harper stumbled through the front door that afternoon, her father Diesel thought he was seeing a ghost. Her scalp was raw. Clumps of hair hung in uneven patches. Tears had carved clean lines through the dirt on her face. She couldn't speak. She just collapsed into his arms, shaking. Diesel was a 30-year member of the Hells Angels. He'd seen violence. He'd seen cruelty. But nothing prepared him for what had been done to his little girl. Within 24 hours, over 300 bikers would descend on this small town. And what happened next? No one saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The house was quiet. One of those late afternoons when the air feels thick and nothing moves. When the front door suddenly slammed open hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Diesel looked up, confused at first, because Harper never entered like that. She was gentle even in the smallest habits. But the sound was wrong. Too sharp. Too desperate. A sound pulled out of fear. She stood there in the doorway, breathing in short, broken bursts. The light behind her poured across her hair, what was left of it, and caught on the uneven patches, the torn clumps, the raw humiliation carved into her small silhouette. For a moment, Diesel couldn't understand what he was seeing. His mind refused it, as if reality might rearrange itself if he blinked hard enough. Harper didn't speak. She didn't have to. The ruin of her hair told the story before she could force out a single word. The room went silent. Not the normal kind of silence, but that crushing kind where even the air seems to pause, waiting to see what a father will do. Diesel's breath stuttered. His hands rose halfway, then hesitated, trembling in midair as if afraid that touching her would make the truth real. When he finally reached her, he did it slowly, with the tenderness of someone handling something shattered. Harper stepped into him, small and shaking, and he folded his arms around her without saying a word. There was nothing to say yet. Language is too clumsy for moments like this. So he simply held her while the horror of what had been done settled over him like dust. His fingertips brushed the uneven stubble along the back of her head, the tufts where hair had been ripped rather than cut. She flinched, not at the touch itself, but at the memory attached to it. Diesel felt that flinch run through his own body, a jolt of helplessness followed by something heavier, hotter, rising slowly from the center of his chest. He pulled back just enough to look at her. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears, her eyes red and swollen, her voice muted by shock. And in that fragile face, he saw everything at once. Fear, humiliation, the instinct to apologize for something she should never have had to endure. His confusion hardened into understanding, and that understanding darkened into something deeper, something primal. What Diesel didn't know yet, what he would discover in the next few hours, was that this wasn't random cruelty. This moment, this devastation standing barefoot in his doorway, was the final act in an 8-month campaign of torment that adults had witnessed and chosen to ignore. But right now, all he could do was hold his daughter, steady himself in the silence, and feel the first tremors of a storm building inside him, one that would not rest until the truth was laid bare. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Diesel kept his arms around Harper, feeling the small tremors still running through her body. When she finally pulled back, she didn't lift her head. She stared at the floor, her breath catching every few seconds like her lungs were trying to remember how to work. Diesel knelt to meet her eyes, but she wouldn't look at him. That alone told him how deep this went. Whatever had happened behind that gym hadn't begun today. This was the breaking point of something far older, far heavier. He softened his voice, careful not to push too quickly. Harper had always been gentle. Quiet in a way that wasn't shyness but sensitivity, as though she noticed things the world trampled past. Diesel used to joke that she had her mother's eyes, always seeing more than she let on. And since her mother's death 2 years earlier, he'd been trying, piece by piece, to bring back her smile. He'd thought he was succeeding. But now he could see the truth. She hadn't been healing. She'd been hiding. He touched her chin lightly, enough that her gaze finally lifted. When she looked at him, he saw a fear that didn't belong in any child's eyes. He asked her, softly, what had happened. And Harper whispered the first piece of the story. It wasn't just today. The words came slowly at first, halting and buried under guilt. She told him about the boys, 3 of them, all older, 11 years old, loud and confident in that way children become when they learn early that the world bends for them. She told him how it started with mocking, the kind whispered behind her back during art class or muttered when she walked past in the hall. She told him about how they laughed at her drawings, called her strange, called her weak, called her the girl who cried too easily. She told him how it escalated, her sketchbook going missing, only to reappear torn, her pencils snapped in half, her backpack dumped out behind the cafeteria. She described the shoves, the tripping, the way they'd take turns knocking her books from her arms just to watch her scramble to pick them up. And then she told him something worse. Adults had seen it. Teachers, aides, staff who stood in the hallway as though supervision meant occupying space, not protecting children. When Harper tried to tell them, they dismissed her. One teacher in particular, a woman Diesel vaguely remembered from parent conferences, kept telling her the same phrase. "You're too sensitive," as though the cruelty was her fault. As though an 8-year-old grieving her mother should have been tougher, quieter, more convenient. Diesel felt something coil tightly in his chest. But he kept his voice steady. Harper was finally talking. He wouldn't interrupt her now. She explained how the bullies had grown bolder each month, certain no one would stop them. And they were right, no one did. Not once. Each complaint was waved away. Each tear met with a shrug. Each small humiliation swallowed because Harper believed, in that way only children can, that maybe the grown-ups were right. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she was the problem. The longer she spoke, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't the chaos of childhood cruelty. This was targeted, sustained, enabled. Diesel listened, jaw tightening, breath deepening. And beneath Harper's halting words, a darker truth began to surface. The teacher knew. She'd seen them corner Harper in the hallways. She'd watched them knock books from her hands. And every time Harper tried to speak up, this woman, this adult entrusted with the well-being of children, told her she was simply too sensitive. But here's what made it worse. Now, the narration pauses, because what comes next explains everything. The families of those boys weren't just well off. They were donors, major contributors to the school's funding. Their names were spoken in staff meetings with a kind of reverence. Their money had built new classrooms, renovated the athletic fields, and padded budgets that otherwise would have been bare. The administration had grown dependent on them. And when dependence turns into fear, accountability dies. Every complaint about those boys was quietly filed away. Every incident softened until it sounded harmless. Every time Harper found the courage to speak, her words were drowned beneath the weight of who her bullies' parents were. And in that living room, as Harper's voice cracked and she apologized for not being strong enough, Diesel felt the anger of the audience begin to mirror his own. A deep, rising fury at a system that had looked at a grieving child and decided her pain was worth less than a donation check. Harper wasn't the problem. She never had been. She was a quiet girl with a sketchbook trying to navigate a world that had already taken so much from her. And the people meant to protect her had chosen the comfort of wealthy adults over the safety of a vulnerable child. That truth settled between them, heavy and unforgivable. And for the first time, Diesel understood that today's horror wasn't an isolated act. It was the inevitable end of months of cruelty left to grow unchecked. The truth of that afternoon unfolded slowly, as though each detail had to be coaxed from a place Harper didn't want to revisit. Diesel listened without interrupting, steadying his breath as she described the day that had led her to burst through their front door in terror. It had started like any ordinary dismissal. The bell rang, students spilled out, and the usual chorus of laughter, backpacks zipping, and hurried footsteps filled the courtyard. Harper waited for the crowd to thin. She always did. It made the walk to the pickup area feel a little safer. That day, she lingered longer than usual, hoping the boys had already left. She checked twice, first glancing over her shoulder, then pausing near the bike racks, pretending to tie her shoe just to scan the area. She didn't see them, so she started toward the lot, small and alone, clutching her sketchbook to her chest like a shield. But as she passed the corner of the gym, the air changed. Footsteps behind her. 3 sets, purposeful, too close. She froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She felt it in her stomach, that deep instinctive dread that children learn too young when no one protects them. The boys stepped in front of her, cutting off her path. Their shadows stretched across the pavement, longer than they should have looked. Harper tried to move sideways, but they shifted with her. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The smirks on their faces told her they'd planned this. Told her they'd waited for the moment she was isolated. Told her the adults weren't coming. She tried to run. One grabbed her wrist. Another blocked her escape. The third pushed her backward until her shoulders hit the rough wall of the gym. Even then, Harper thought, hoped, this would be like the other times, a shove, a taunt, maybe her belongings stolen again. She could endure those. She had endured them for months. But this time was different. The tallest boy reached into his backpack. Harper didn't understand what she was seeing at first. The object looked out of place, wrong in the hands of a child. Then she heard the click, the hum, a low mechanical buzz that grew louder as he lifted it toward her. An electric razor. Harper's breath fractured. She shook her head, begging without words, but the boys didn't hesitate. They grabbed her arms, pinning her against the wall. The razor touched the side of her head, and she screamed, a sound that tore itself out of her before she could control it. They laughed. The more she struggled, the harder they held her. Clumps of hair fell to the ground, dark against the concrete. She cried so hard she could barely breathe, twisting her body, trying to escape their grip, but they were older, stronger, and energized by the thrill of her terror. And then came the worst part. One of them pulled out a phone. The lens caught her tears, her shaking, her humiliation. It captured her terror in trembling close-up as the razor carved uneven paths across her scalp. Her voice cracked raw from crying. She called out for help, but after-school hours meant empty hallways, empty fields, empty windows. No one came. No one even heard her. The buzzing stopped only when the oldest boy grew bored. They stepped back, letting her collapse to her knees. She tried to gather the fallen pieces of her hair, her hands shaking as though she could somehow undo what they had done. The boys laughed again, satisfied, proud of themselves. And then, before running off, they made sure the camera was still recording. They filmed it. These three boys, 11 years old, held down an 8-year-old girl who had lost her mother 2 years earlier, shaved her head in uneven patches while she screamed, and filmed the entire thing. For fun. Harper didn't know the video was already being sent from phone to phone, spreading through group chats before she had even made it out of the schoolyard. She didn't know that her worst moment had become entertainment. She didn't know that within hours her father would see it. And she certainly didn't know what was about to happen next. But in that moment, all she knew was the weight of her own hair in her hands, the sting on her scalp, and the crushing silence of a place where adults should have been, but weren't. This was the moment the story reached its lowest point. The moment that broke something inside her. The moment that forced Diesel to confront a truth far darker than bullying alone. That cruelty grows without limit when no one in power stops it. When Harper finally finished speaking, Diesel felt a kind of stillness settle inside him. Not the quiet of defeat, but the focused silence that comes before a decision that cannot be undone. He held her again, steadying her breath with his own. Rage pulsed through him. Yes, but it wasn't the wild kind that pushes a man toward recklessness. This was something sharper, something with intention, something that came from a father who understood that he had reached a crossroads. There were many kinds of justice in the world, some delivered in anger, others in patience. Diesel knew he had to choose which one his daughter needed. He watched Harper fall asleep against his chest, exhaustion claiming her in small shivers. And in that moment, he made his choice. Not vengeance, not chaos, but protection, absolute, undeniable protection that no one would ever question again. He laid her gently on the couch, tucked a blanket around her shoulders, and stepped into the kitchen. His hands were shaking as he reached for his phone, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. He dialed the number he'd only used in moments that mattered. The call rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, gravelly and alert even in the late hours. "Talk to me, brother." Diesel swallowed hard. He didn't know how to say the words, not at first. When they finally came, they were simple. "It's Harper." A pause. A long one. Then, quietly, "What happened?" Diesel told him. Not every detail. Not the way she screamed. Not the way the razor vibrated against her skin. Not the way she ran home with her hair falling in clumps behind her. But enough. Enough for the man on the other end of the line to understand. Enough for silence to fill the space again, heavier than before. "We're handling this," the chapter president said at last. "You're not alone in this." Diesel didn't ask for anything more. He didn't have to. Within minutes, the message was spreading. First through his chapter, then through neighboring ones. Phones rang in garages, in living rooms, at truck stops, and midnight diners. Men who had never met Harper heard what had been done to her and didn't hesitate. Loyalty didn't require explanation. Calls traveled from county to county, then state to state. Diesel's phone buzzed nonstop. Messages, confirmations, questions that weren't really questions at all. When do you need us? Where are we meeting? How fast should we ride? These were not men driven by the thrill of retaliation. These were men who understood the unspoken code. A child had been harmed. A brother had been failed by a system meant to protect his own, and now the responsibility fell to them. By midnight, Diesel had received word from over a dozen chapters. Brothers from 3 states over were already packing their bikes, throwing gear into saddlebags, checking headlights, tightening bolts. They didn't ask for justification. They didn't ask whether the boys were punished yet. They didn't care about the politics of school administration or the excuses adults would surely try to hide behind. They cared about Harper. They cared that a little girl had been brutalized while adults looked the other way. They cared that Diesel, a man who would bend the world for his child, needed them. And by sunrise, the largest gathering of Hell's Angels this town had ever seen would arrive at the school's front gates. But not for the reason anyone expected. Diesel wasn't calling them for revenge. He wasn't calling them to intimidate or threaten or scorch the earth behind those responsible. He was planning something far more powerful. He was planning accountability, visibility, a presence so unmistakable that the people who had ignored Harper's suffering would no longer be able to pretend they hadn't seen it. The hours passed slowly. Diesel stayed awake, listening to the gentle breathing of his daughter in the next room, gripping his phone like a lifeline. With every message, every promise of support, every confirmation of a rider leaving home in the dead of night, his resolve deepened. He wasn't acting out of fury anymore. He was acting out of love. And when dawn finally touched the horizon, thin and pale, it carried with it the first distant rumble of engines. Low, thunderous, undeniable. The sound of men arriving with purpose. The sun rose at 6:47 a.m. that morning, and with it came the sound of thunder. Before we continue, if you believe that adults should protect children, not look the other way for money, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Because the people who covered this up, they were counting on silence. They were counting on nobody caring. Prove them wrong. Subscribe, and let's keep going, because what happens next changed everything. The sound came long before anyone saw them. In the pale gray quiet of early morning, when the town was still half asleep and the school parking lot sat empty except for a few staff cars, a low vibration began to hum through the air. At first it was faint, so subtle that a person might mistake it for distant thunder or the rumble of a passing storm. But it didn't fade. It grew, deepened, layered, until the windows of nearby houses began to tremble in their frames. Parents sipping coffee on porches looked up, confused. Early rising joggers slowed to a stop. Teachers arriving ahead of the first bell paused with their keys still in their hands. The sound rolled over the town like a warning, building with every passing second. And then, just after dawn fully broke, the first headlights appeared on the long stretch of main road. A pair at first, then a cluster, then a line so long it blurred into the morning haze. The engines weren't just loud. They were coordinated, steady, and impossibly numerous. Row after row of motorcycles crested the rise, their riders in formation, the convoy stretching farther than anyone in that town had ever seen. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a mob. It was a procession, disciplined, deliberate, unstoppable. Parents hurried their children back inside their houses, pulling curtains tight with shaking hands. Teachers who had stepped out of their cars froze, mouths slightly open, unsure whether to run, hide, or simply stare. The principal, arriving moments too late to pretend she hadn't seen what was happening, fumbled for her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911, tripping over her own words while trying to explain what she was witnessing. But by then, the riders were already turning into the school grounds. 300 strong. They circled the school with practiced precision, filling every edge of the property line, their engines echoing off the brick walls until it sounded like the building itself was trembling. And then, in perfect unison, those engines began to shut off, one after another, the roar diminishing into a strange, heavy quiet. The silence that followed felt unnatural. The men dismounted, boots striking pavement in rhythmic sequences. They didn't rush. They didn't glare. They didn't brandish anything. They simply moved with purpose, stepping into formation around the school, as though drawing a protective barrier in plain sight of every parent, every staff member, every child peeking from behind a window. The principal, watching from the front doors, felt her breath catch. She had imagined retaliation, shouting, threats, chaos. She had imagined the kind of scene that would justify her fear and validate her excuses. But this? She did not know what to do with this. Because the bikers did not approach her. They did not speak to anyone. They just stood there, 300 men, shoulder to shoulder, in absolute stillness. And that stillness was unnerving in a way noise could never be. Everyone watching assumed they knew what came next. These were Hell's Angels, after all. These were outlaws, men with reputations that stretched far beyond this quiet town. Surely, any second now, voices would rise, fists would fly, windows would shatter. Parents whispered frantically, pulling children away from the scene. Teachers exchanged terrified glances. Police units, already en route, floored their accelerators, bracing for the worst. But when the engines died and the men finally stood at rest, something strange happened. Nothing. No one stormed the building. No one demanded names. No one issued threats. They simply waited. 300 men. Silent. Immovable. Watching. And the town realized something quickly. Silence can be far more terrifying than rage. Because silence leaves the guilty nowhere to hide. Remember what I told you earlier about the wealthy parents who used their money to make problems disappear? Right now, those parents were waking to phone calls, frantic voices telling them to turn on the news, to check the school, to prepare for something they could not buy their way out of. For the first time in their lives, their checkbooks were useless. This gathering wasn't about money. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about accountability, an unspoken declaration that no child, especially not a child already wounded by loss, would be left unprotected again. And as the bikers stood in flawless formation, the town finally understood. This was not the beginning of violence. It was the beginning of consequence. When the moment finally came, Diesel didn't bring the full force of the 300 men waiting outside. He didn't need to. He chose 3 brothers. Men he trusted, men who understood restraint and purpose. Together, they walked toward the school's front doors with a quiet certainty that made the teachers watching from the hallway step back without a word. Diesel pushed open the doors, the hinges groaning in a way that seemed to echo through the entire building. The secretary looked up from her desk, a stack of attendance sheets still clutched in her hands. Her face drained of color the instant she recognized him. Papers slipped from her fingers and scattered across the carpet. She didn't bend to pick them up. Her voice wavered. She's in a meeting. Maybe you could. But before she could finish, the principal emerged from her office, drawn by the presence she could feel even before she saw it. The sight of Diesel, broad-shouldered, resolute, flanked by men whose silence carried more weight than threats, stopped her mid-step. Fear flickered in her eyes, not because she expected violence, but because she understood something far worse. There was nowhere left to hide. Diesel's voice cut through the hallway, low and controlled. Who let this happen to my daughter? The question hung there, heavy as stone. The principal tried to steady herself, but her breath shook. She gestured weakly toward her office, inviting them inside with the mechanical politeness of someone hoping protocol might still save her. Diesel entered first, the room suddenly feeling too small, too exposed. And then the revelations began to unfold. The first was the teacher. In a locked drawer in her classroom sat months of documented incidents, notes of confrontations, observations of bullying, signs of escalating aggression. She had written it all down, not to act on it, but to protect herself. A paper trail of neglect disguised as diligence. She had seen it happening and chosen silence. Then came the principal's part. Diesel listened as the truth twisted into place. She had received 3 formal complaints, all from Harper's father, each one detailing harassment. She had read them, she had acknowledged them, and she had buried them, not out of ignorance, not out of misunderstanding, out of fear, because the boys responsible had parents with money, real influence, the kind that shaped budgets and secured promotions. Parents who threatened to pull their donations the moment their sons were mentioned in disciplinary reports. Parents who believed consequences were for other people's children, not their own. The principal whispered the words as though confessing to a crime. In a way, she was. But the rot went deeper still. The school board, eager to maintain their financial lifeline, had instructed staff to handle it quietly. No reports filed. No confrontations with the families. No documentation that might jeopardize donor relationships. What Harper endured had been permitted, shielded by adults who cared more about funding than the safety of an 8-year-old girl. Diesel didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or threaten or lash out. He simply stood there, absorbing each revelation with a stillness that frightened those in the room more than rage ever could. Because silence, in moments like this, is a judgment. Then came the breadcrumb payoff. Remember the video? The one those boys filmed while they shaved Harper's head? It had been shared to a group chat, bouncing from student to student with sickening speed. And one of the kids in that chat had a father who was a police officer. By the time Diesel walked into that principal's office, law enforcement already had a copy. The evidence wasn't going anywhere. No donation could erase it. No influence could soften it. For the first time, the room shifted. The power wasn't with the administration anymore. It wasn't with the wealthy families. It was with the truth, and the witnesses standing outside in perfect formation. The parents arrived next, bursting through the doorway with lawyers in tow, confidence brittle but not yet broken. They tried the same tactics they'd relied on for years: threats, legal jargon, polite intimidation wrapped in expensive suits. But something was different now, because through the window, they could see the rows of motorcycles. They could see the 300 silent men who had come not to harm, but to ensure the truth could not be buried again. News vans were pulling up. Cameras were rolling. The old playbook didn't work anymore. Now, I want you to imagine being one of those wealthy parents in that moment. For years, you've bought your way out of consequences. For years, your money has been your superpower. And now you're standing in a school office. Your lawyers are stammering. And through the window, you see 300 Hell's Angels standing in perfect silence, waiting to see what you'll do next. The currency has changed, and you are suddenly, unmistakably, very poor. The cover-up was collapsing, and justice, slow, steady, disciplined, was finally taking shape. The shift in the room was almost palpable. For so long, the adults in power had operated under the assumption that their decisions, or their lack of decisions, would never be challenged. But standing there now, confronted by evidence, law enforcement, and 300 silent witnesses outside the school walls, they realized the truth. Accountability had finally arrived, and it arrived without a single raised fist. The school board convened an emergency session on site, hastily gathering in a conference room that suddenly felt too small to contain the weight of what was happening. Diesel did not sit. He stood near the door, arms crossed, not imposing himself but anchoring the space with a presence that made excuses impossible. The first consequence fell on the two boys who had orchestrated the assault. Their parents tried to argue, demanded due process, attempted to frame the incident as a lapse in judgment, or boys being boys. But the video existed. The audio existed. Their son's laughter existed. There was no room for spin. The board chair announced the decision with a tremor in her voice: immediate expulsion. No probation. No negotiation. Their academic records would reflect the severity of their actions. Silence settled over the room as their parents absorbed the reality that for the first time, money had not shielded them. The third boy's situation was different. He had participated, yes, but hesitated. In the video's reflection, faint but visible, there were moments where his expression faltered, where his hands shook. His parents didn't storm into the room with legal threats. They didn't attempt to justify anything. They sat quietly, faces drawn, as the board announced a long-term suspension paired with mandatory counseling. And instead of fighting it, they simply nodded. There was grief in their eyes, but also relief. Relief that the truth was finally out. Relief that their son would be forced into the help they had been too overwhelmed to pursue. Then came the teacher. The evidence she had kept, months of notes documenting bullying incidents, became the very proof of her failure. She had seen everything and acted on nothing. When confronted, she attempted to explain herself, but every excuse fell flat. Oversight is one thing, neglect is another. Her suspension was immediate. Her teaching license would go under review. And the district representative present made one thing clear: this was not a matter they intended to handle quietly. The principal's reckoning followed. She stood before the board, hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles whitened. But there was no explanation that could undo what she had allowed. Administrative leave was issued on the spot. A formal investigation launched. No timeline for return. No promise of reinstatement. In her eyes, there was disbelief, shock that the authority she'd wielded so confidently had evaporated in a single morning. And then the wealthiest parents entered the room, accustomed to influence, accustomed to control, accustomed to being heard before anyone else. This time, they were told to sit. Their donations were returned, every dollar of them. Their privileged access to school decision-making was revoked. Civil lawsuits were already being drafted. And the board's attorney, after reviewing the emerging timeline of events, made it clear that turning a blind eye to sustained bullying was not just unethical. It was actionable. Retaliation had not come in the form they feared. It had come in the form they never expected, systems finally doing their job. But here's what nobody expected, what I didn't expect when I first heard this story. One of the wealthy fathers, one of the loudest voices against accountability, broke. Right there in that office, with his lawyers beside him and his reputation cracking around him, he began to sob. Not the angry, performative kind of crying meant to sway opinion, but the raw collapse of a man who had been carrying a truth he'd never wanted to face. His son had shown troubling behaviors for years. Aggression, cruelty, disregard for others. And instead of getting him help, he had thrown money at the problem, hoping donations would smooth over the warning signs. His voice shook as he covered his face with trembling hands, repeating the same words again and again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't excuse his role, but it revealed something important, something uncomfortable and deeply human. Systems don't break on their own. People break them. And often, those people are themselves caught in cycles of pride, fear, image, and denial. The justice unfolding here wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a story of perfect villains and perfect heroes. It was a reckoning that exposed every layer of failure, individual, parental, administrative, institutional. And for the first time, everyone in that room was forced to face it. When the decisions were finalized and the consequences delivered, most people assumed the bikers would simply mount their engines and ride off, storm in, storm out, leaving only the echo of thunder behind them. But that's the thing about assumptions. They only work when you misunderstand the people you're watching. The men outside weren't there for intimidation. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there for Harper. And once justice took root, they understood something Diesel had already learned the hard way. Punishment fixes the past. Protection fixes the future. So they stayed. What began as a show of solidarity evolved into something the school had never seen before. It started small. Just a few riders stepping forward when teachers asked how they could possibly rebuild trust with their students. Instead of shrugging, these men offered stories. Hard stories. Lessons learned the difficult way. Soon, an idea took shape. Anti-bullying workshops. Not the usual scripted, sanitized assemblies kids sleep through. These were real conversations about consequence, respect, and what it means to protect the vulnerable. Students listened. Teachers listened. Even parents lingered longer than expected, drawn in by the sincerity of men who weren't polished speakers but were unmistakably honest. And then came the escort program. One of the riders noticed a girl, tiny, nervous, standing alone at the edge of the parking lot one morning, waiting until the last moment to walk inside. She reminded him of Harper. Without thinking, he walked her to the front doors, not close enough to frighten her, but close enough that anyone watching understood she wasn't alone. The next day, another child asked for the same. Then another. By the end of the week, a quiet line had formed. Children who had spent their whole school lives trying not to be noticed were now walking through the gates beside men who made sure they were seen. It wasn't intimidation. It was reassurance. The chapter formalized it shortly after. Vulnerable kids, the quiet ones, the easy targets, were suddenly surrounded by a protective presence the faculty hadn't been able to offer. And surprisingly, the school embraced it. Not because it was traditional, not because it was comfortable, but because, for the first time, the children who needed help the most were actually getting it. From there, the outreach expanded. The bikers set up a direct hotline for students, one that bypassed the layers of bureaucracy that had failed Harper. If a child felt unsafe or mistreated, they could call. They could text. They could reach someone who would listen, someone who wouldn't brush their fears aside or label them too sensitive. It became the chapter's promise. No child would go unheard again. But their deepest commitment was to Harper herself. For the rest of the school year, without fail, there was always a Hell's Angel in the parking lot during pickup and drop-off. Rain or shine, scorching heat or freezing mornings, someone was there. Not hovering, not intruding, just present. A quiet promise that what happened to her would never happen again. Diesel didn't ask them to do it. He didn't have to. Brotherhood doesn't evaporate once headlines fade. Remember Harper, the quiet girl who sat alone at recess with her sketchbook? The one her teacher claimed was too sensitive? Well, she wasn't alone anymore. She would never be alone again. And then came the final twist, one few people saw coming. 6 weeks after the investigation began, the district announced its conclusion. The teacher who had dismissed Harper's cries for help wasn't just suspended, she was terminated. Her license was revoked permanently. The documentation she'd hoarded as self-protection became the evidence that stripped her of the career she'd hidden behind. But the part that still lingers, the moment that reveals more about her than any file ever could, was her final statement to the board. Even then, even in the face of overwhelming truth, she insisted she'd done nothing wrong. She claimed Harper was simply too sensitive. It was the same phrase she'd repeated again and again. Some people never learn. But at least now she would never again stand in front of a classroom and call indifference a teaching strategy. If you're still watching, if this story has moved you, I want you to take 10 seconds right now and type one word in the comments. Justice. Because every comment, every like, every share tells the algorithm that stories like this matter. It tells YouTube that audiences want to see good people standing up for kids who can't stand up for themselves. The bullies in this world, they're counting on your silence. So don't be silent. Comment, justice, and let's finish this story together. Healing does not begin with sunlight. It begins in the quiet moments after the storm, when the world is still rearranging itself and the wounds finally have room to breathe. For Harper, those first weeks were fragile, a delicate balancing act between small steps forward and sudden stumbles backward. Diesel understood this. He never rushed her. In the mornings, he noticed how she still flinched at loud sounds. Doors closing, engines revving, even the accidental clatter of a dropped spoon. Her body reacted before her mind could reason with it. At night, the nightmares came, not every night, but often enough that Diesel kept a lamp on in her room, soft and steady. Sometimes she woke crying, but didn't want to explain why. Sometimes she didn't cry at all. She simply curled closer to her father, as if trying to anchor herself to something safe. School was harder. The idea of returning felt impossible to her. Every time Diesel gently brought it up, Harper's eyes would drop, voice softening to nearly nothing. She wasn't afraid of the building itself. She was afraid of being seen, of the memory of what had happened lingering in the corners of every hallway. Diesel didn't force her. He knew recovery couldn't be commanded. It had to be invited. And then, unexpectedly, the turning point arrived. One afternoon, a woman came to the house. A Hell's Angel's wife, someone Diesel trusted but Harper barely knew. She sat with Harper on the back porch, not asking questions, not pushing conversation. Eventually, she shared something personal. She had been bullied as a child too. She knew the shame, the confusion, the feeling that maybe something inside you had caused it. She told Harper the truth no one had told her at that age. None of it had been her fault. Not one moment, not one word, not one injury. She taught Harper how to breathe through the fear instead of giving it a home. Something softened in Harper's posture as she listened. It wasn't a breakthrough all at once, but it was the first spark. Small victories followed. One morning, Diesel found her sitting at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open. Not drawing yet, just touching the pages, reacquainting herself with the craft she had abandoned in the months of torment. The next day, she made a single mark. By the end of the week, she was sketching again, tentative strokes at first, then bolder ones. Diesel didn't comment. He simply watched her from the doorway, feeling something in his chest unclench for the first time since that awful day. And one evening, completely unexpectedly, Harper laughed. A real laugh. Not polite, not forced, not thin or shaky, but bright. The kind of sound that belonged to a child who was finally remembering what joy felt like. Diesel froze, afraid to break the moment. It came and went quickly, but it was enough. It was proof she was coming back. The community responded, too, in ways no one predicted. Classmates sent cards, some awkward, some heartfelt, all genuine. Children who had stood on the sidelines, too afraid to intervene, apologized in handwritten notes. Teachers who had once overlooked her began paying careful attention, offering support that should have been there from the beginning. For once, the adults were learning. Harper transformed through these moments. Before everything happened, she had been withdrawn, grieving, and easily overlooked. Through the aftermath, she became protected, validated, and finally seen. And after the support, the workshops, the escorts, the apologies, she began to grow into someone confident, creative, and quietly resilient. 2 years earlier, Harper had lost her mother to senseless violence. And in the aftermath, she had learned that the world could be cruel beyond understanding. But now she was learning something else entirely. She was learning that the world also contained people who would drive through the night, leave their lives behind, and show up, 300 strong, just to make sure one little girl knew she mattered. Her healing wasn't linear, but it was real, and the clearest symbol of it came each morning as she stood at the mirror. Her hair was growing back. At first, just the faintest fuzz, then soft strands that caught the light, then fuller, thicker patches that slowly reclaimed the shape she had once known. Diesel watched her brush it with a careful tenderness, as though each stroke rewrote a piece of what had been taken from her. Sometimes he had to turn away, swallowing the emotion that rose too quickly in his throat. Because that hair wasn't just hair anymore. Every strand was a declaration of survival, of strength, of a little girl who had been hurt, but refused to stay broken. Harper was healing, and this time, she wasn't doing it alone. Change rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often, it begins quietly. One rule rewritten, one voice finally heard, one truth acknowledged after too long in the dark. Harper's story didn't just reshape her life or Diesel's life. It reshaped the town. It reshaped the school. It reshaped the way people thought about responsibility, silence, and the cost of looking away. The school district moved first. Administrators who once dismissed bullying as an unfortunate but unavoidable part of childhood found themselves forced to confront the consequences of their neglect. In emergency meetings, they drafted new anti-bullying protocols, specific, enforceable, no longer framed as suggestions but as obligations. Every incident had to be documented. Every report had to be addressed. Staff were required to intervene, no matter who was involved or what pressure they felt from parents with money or influence. Mandatory reporting was no longer a formality. It became the backbone of their duty. And with that, something began to shift. Children who had once stayed silent, out of fear, out of habit, out of uncertainty, found their voices. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments. A student stepped forward about something they'd witnessed. Another confessed they had been too afraid to help Harper but didn't want to be silent anymore. The culture of the school, once shaped by hierarchy and hush, slowly began to change. Students realized that telling the truth didn't make them weak. It made them part of the solution. What happened in that small town didn't stay buried within its borders, either. Word of the bikers' actions spread through the Hells Angels Brotherhood. First as a story passed from chapter to chapter, then as inspiration. Riders in other states began organizing their own outreach programs. Schools thousands of miles away received visits from men who stood tall not to intimidate, but to teach. The message was simple. Protection is a collective responsibility, and children deserve to feel safe no matter where they grow up. Even the lives of the boys who had caused the harm began to change, though in ways none of their parents would have predicted. One of the expelled boys, after months of mandatory counseling, wrote Harper a letter. Just a few pages, handwritten, uneven in places where emotion had made his hand unsteady. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't minimize what he had done. He apologized, plainly, honestly. Harper never wrote back. She wasn't ready for that. But she read the letter. She tucked it into a drawer. And when she closed it, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not comfort, but a tiny shift inside her chest where the weight of anger had been resting. Something like peace, fragile but real. Now, I know what you might be thinking right now. You might be thinking, this is a nice story, but does it really change anything? Kids still get bullied every day. Wealthy people still buy their way out of consequences. Adults still look the other way. And you're right. All of that is still true. But here's what I've learned from telling stories like this for years. Every single person who stands up shifts the balance. Every single act of protection matters. Every single time a community refuses to stay silent, the world gets a little bit better. Maybe not for everyone, but for someone. And sometimes, that someone is everything. Remember the principal's panic call to 911 the morning the bikers arrived? The police who showed up that day had been bracing for chaos. Shouting, confrontation, escalation. They arrived expecting the worst. Instead, they found a scene they would later describe as almost reverent. 300 men in leather, standing shoulder to shoulder, not demanding anything, but watching justice unfold through proper channels. The sergeant on scene later said it was the most polite confrontation he'd ever witnessed. Not a threat, not a riot, just a promise to stay until the right thing was done. And that, more than anything, became the legacy of what happened. Not the thunder of the engines, not the shock of the consequences, not even the headlines that followed. It was the discipline, the patience, the unspoken vow embodied by 300 men who made it unmistakably clear that they would not leave until a small girl was safe, heard, and protected. The ripple effects of that vow reached far beyond the school walls. They touched families, policies, neighboring towns, and distant chapters. They reached anyone who needed to be reminded that change is possible, even in the smallest places, even in the quietest moments, even when the world has a long way left to go. Healing rarely announces itself with triumph. It doesn't arrive with bright fanfare or dramatic declarations. More often, it appears quietly, almost shyly, slipping into the cracks left behind by pain. It grows slowly, like something learning to trust the world again. That was how it happened for Harper. Softly, imperceptibly at first, like the slow return of color to something washed dull by too many storms. For months had passed since the bikers rode into town. For months of rebuilding and relearning, of small victories and long nights, of a father and daughter growing closer in ways neither had expected but both desperately needed. Diesel had done everything he could to help her heal, but even he knew that some parts of recovery only time could touch. It was a Sunday evening, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of night that feels suspended between the week that has ended and the one about to begin. Diesel sat on the couch, his boots still unlaced, body heavy with the fatigue that comes from carrying too much for too long. The television flickered in front of him, shifting from channel to channel as he absently flipped the remote, not absorbing anything he saw. His mind drifted, as it had every day since the incident, through memories he wished he could rewrite and fears he wished he could forget. Then he heard footsteps, soft ones, familiar ones. Harper appeared in the doorway, framed by the dim lamplight of the hallway. Her hair, once violently stripped away, had grown past her ears now. It curled gently at the ends, giving her a softness she hadn't worn since before the bullying began. It wasn't just hair, it was proof. Proof of healing, proof of resilience, proof that the cruelty she endured hadn't managed to take everything from her, no matter how hard it tried. She didn't say a word. She simply walked toward him with a calmness that felt new, her footsteps deliberate but unhurried. Diesel turned off the television, sensing something in her presence he couldn't quite name yet. She stood in front of him for a moment, looking at him with eyes that were clearer than they had been in months. Still young, still tender, but steadier. Then she climbed into his lap, just like she used to when the world was simpler and her greatest worry was whether her crayons had been organized the way she liked them. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her small frame settling against his chest, as though she had finally found the place she had been trying to return to all along. Diesel closed his eyes. He held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other resting across her back. She fit there so easily, as though the months of fear hadn't stretched the space between them, but had instead deepened it, made it more meaningful. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Silence. True silence can be healing when shared between two people who have survived something together. Harper's breathing steadied against him, a slow rhythm that soothed some corner of Diesel's heart he hadn't realized was still frayed. He felt her fingers curl into the fabric of his shirt, holding on gently but deliberately, not out of fear but out of closeness. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, letting the quiet settle around them. And then, in the softest voice he had ever heard from her, a whisper rose to his ear. "Dad, I'm happy again." Diesel froze. It wasn't shock. It wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper, something like a dam inside him breaking without warning. His breath caught mid-inhale. His arms tightened around her instinctively, as though anchoring her words to his chest before they could drift away. His throat closed, emotion rising so fast and so fiercely that he couldn't speak even if he tried. For months, he had carried her pain as though it were his own. He had fought for her, protected her, stood beside her through every setback and every breakthrough. He had watched her struggle to sleep, watched her tremble at sudden noises, watched her grapple with a fear she never should have had to learn. He had walked with her through each fragile step toward normalcy, hoping, quietly, desperately, that she would someday feel whole again. But he never dared to assume when that day might come. And now, here she was, her voice small but sure, offering him the 4 words he had prayed for without ever saying them aloud. "Dad, I'm happy again." He couldn't answer. His voice was gone. His chest tightened with the overwhelming force of relief, love, and grief all crashing together. His eyes filled, slowly at first, then uncontrollably, as he held his daughter closer, burying his face in her hair. She didn't understand the weight of what she'd given him in that moment. She didn't know how those words undid months of self-blame he had quietly carried. Because fathers carry more than children ever realize. Harper had no idea how many nights Diesel had stayed awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events again and again, wondering if he could have protected her sooner, wondering if he had missed signs, wondering if he had failed her. Guilt is a heavy thing for a parent to hold, even when undeserved. But now, her whisper cut through all of it. She was happy again, not pretending, not masking, not trying to be okay for his sake. Truly happy. It was more than a milestone, more than a moment. It was the culmination of every long day, every meeting, every hard conversation, every protective gesture, every mile ridden by 300 men who believed a child deserved safety. Every piece of that journey condensed into 4 simple words from an 8-year-old girl. That was the victory. Not the expulsions, not the policies, not the consequences. This moment, her happiness. Diesel breathed in slowly, holding her as though she were made of light. He didn't need to tell her what she had given him. She could feel it in the way his arms wrapped around her, in the way he exhaled against her hair, in the steady strength of his embrace. Everything they had fought for had led here. For words, "Dad, I'm happy again." And nothing, absolutely nothing, mattered more than that. Harper's life did not return to what it had been before, because she was no longer the child who quietly folded herself into the corners of classrooms, hoping not to be noticed. What she built after the storm was something new, something steadier, something shaped not by fear, but by the strength of knowing she had survived, and that she had never been as alone as she once believed. School became different for her, slowly, then all at once. She was no longer the quiet girl who walked with her shoulders tucked inward, hoping the halls would make room for her. She moved with more certainty now, not loud or bold, but present. Teachers noticed it. Students noticed it. Even the ones who had once pretended she didn't exist found themselves drawn to the quiet confidence she now carried. Harper didn't become the loudest kid in the room. She became a leader among the quiet ones. The children who once sat alone at lunch or lingered at the edges of recess found themselves gravitating toward her. She understood them in ways very few people ever had, and she made space for them, simply by being who she had become. Her artwork blossomed alongside her healing. What began as tentative sketches grew into vibrant pieces full of expression and depth far beyond her years. Her father watched with awe as she filled page after page with images that captured emotion the way some people capture breath. Eventually, a local cafe asked to display her drawings. Then a community center. Then a small gallery downtown reached out. Harper didn't know what to make of it at first. She thought she was just drawing to breathe again. But her work touched people. It held something true. And she realized, bit by bit, that her voice didn't need to be loud to be powerful. The bikers never vanished from her life. They didn't fade into memory or linger only as a chapter in a larger story. They stayed. Not every day, not intrusively, but steadfastly. They checked in. They visited. They showed up on her birthdays, not with overwhelming noise, but with kindness. Gifts that reflected the things she loved, sketchbooks, pencils, small tokens of encouragement. She had become part of their extended family, a little sister to a network of men who understood the importance of loyalty and protection. And even as the years passed, the engine of a motorcycle pulling into the driveway never frightened her again. It meant safety. It meant people who cared. Diesel changed, too. He still worried. Fathers don't stop worrying, but the worry no longer consumed him. He no longer woke every day bracing for something to go wrong. He no longer carried guilt like a shadow that clung to every step. He learned to breathe again, truly breathe, knowing his daughter was not just surviving, but thriving. He learned to trust the world a little more. And he learned to trust himself again as a father who had done everything he could and everything he needed to protect the person he loved most. He found himself watching her sometimes, at the table, head bent over a sketch, in the yard, laughing with friends. Curled on the couch, hair falling freely over her shoulders, and marveling at the resilience of a spirit that had every reason to dim, but instead chose to shine brighter. She had not returned to who she was before the cruelty began. She had grown into someone stronger, gentler, more certain of her own worth. Her hair had grown back long now, longer than it had ever been. Thick, healthy, full of life. But she didn't grow it out because she wanted to erase the past. She grew it because she wasn't afraid anymore. She brushed it every morning with a care that was ritualistic, not because she feared losing it again, but because she understood what it symbolized. Harper's hair was more than hair. It was proof. Proof that she had survived what was meant to break her. Proof that she had been protected when it mattered most. Proof that she had been loved, fiercely, endlessly, loudly by some, quietly by others. Proof that no matter how dark those months had been, they had not consumed her. And nobody, not the bullies, not the system that failed her, not the adults who ignored her cries, nobody could take that away from her. Harper's life now was not defined by what happened to her, but by what she became afterward. A girl who rose. A girl who healed. A girl who learned she mattered. I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about the best and worst of what human beings are capable of. Stories of cruelty that should never have happened, and stories of kindness that remind us why hope is still worth holding on to. But Harper's story, this one stays with me. Not just because of the bikers who showed up. Not just because of the justice that finally arrived. It stays with me because of what it teaches us about protection, what it reveals about our responsibility to one another. Most of us will never experience what Diesel did. Most of us will never see 300 Hell's Angels lining the streets on our behalf, engines rumbling like a promise that the vulnerable will not stand alone. Most of us don't have a brotherhood ready to cross state lines in the middle of the night because a child needs them. And that's okay. We don't need to. Because the heart of this story isn't the size of the response. It's the willingness to respond at all. Every single one of us. No matter who we are, no matter what resources we have, no matter how ordinary our lives may seem, has the ability to be someone's protection. We can notice the quiet kid in the room. We can ask the second question instead of accepting the easy answer. We can speak up when instinct tells us to look away. We can be the adult who listens, the friend who pays attention, the bystander who refuses to stay silent simply because silence is comfortable. Harper's story ended well not because the world suddenly became fair, but because a handful of people refused to let unfairness go unchallenged. One father loved his daughter enough to fight for her, patiently, deliberately, courageously. And 300 men believed that protecting the vulnerable was worth their time, their energy, their presence. None of them could undo the cruelty she experienced, but they could make sure she didn't face its aftermath alone. Imagine the world we could build if that mindset weren't rare. If ordinary people chose, just once a day, to intervene instead of ignore. If we stopped treating compassion like a luxury and started treating it like a duty. If we understood that silence doesn't shield the innocent, it shelters the cruel. Harper got her justice. She got her life back. And today, right now, as I tell you this story, she is living safely, happily, surrounded by people who love her. She draws. She laughs. She walks through her school with confidence instead of fear. She is not defined by what happened to her, but by what she became after. Resilient, expressive, deeply loved. And none of that happened because her community was perfect. It happened because, when the moment arrived, good people refused to let unfairness win. That's the truth at the heart of all of this. Justice isn't something delivered by systems alone. It's something created by individuals who choose not to look away. It's shaped by fathers who won't give up, by communities who step in, by strangers who decide that someone else's child is worth protecting. It's created every time an adult listens, Every time a bystander speaks, every time someone says, "Not on my watch." This story stays with me because it shows that protection isn't about strength, it's about willingness. It's about presence. It's about making sure that when cruelty tries to take root, it finds resistance instead of indifference. Harper's world didn't magically become gentle, but the people around her became brave. And that made all the difference. Because in the end, fairness isn't guaranteed. But courage? Courage is a choice. Compassion is a choice. And every time someone chooses them, even in the smallest way,